Many cyclists that are seeking to improve performance would like to train more, or at least have the freedom to train more if they so choose. A trap that's often fallen into though by those with restricted training time is the tendency to over-intensify training in a bid to compensate for a lack of total volume. The common worry is that otherwise effective training frameworks, such as a polarized intensity distribution for instance, aren't going to be an applicable strategy because of the greater emphasis on higher proportions of low intensity. And with popular training metrics like training stress score and chronic training load that often skew on the side of intensity, as well as this intuitive idea that the harder you push, the more you'll improve, it's not difficult to see why this is such a common pitfall. Unfortunately, this tenet fails to recognize a few key principles. Firstly, that high intensity isn't a simple shortcut to higher performance, and that more intensity is seldom the answer to long-term fitness improvement. After all, very few cyclists struggle to ride hard enough, but a lot comparatively struggle to hold back sufficiently when prescribed workouts at lower intensities like recovery sessions or longer duration endurance workouts. And secondly, that it's the aerobic system rather than the anaerobic system that needs the most training attention when volume is on the lower side. Since aerobic metabolism is the predominant energy system used to produce energy in endurance-based activities, when training volume goes down, the balance of these two systems begins to lean more towards being anaerobically driven. This means that more carbohydrate is used for energy production, which means that more lactate is produced, which then means that the lactate threshold is lowered. What's potentially the most underappreciated factor though is not the reduced capacity for training, but crucially the even more restricted capacity for good quality recovery and adaptation. Speaking anecdotally from our own experience of working with a lot of athletes that fit this time-limited profile, what we've found is that a greater shift towards higher proportions of low intensity, as well as a greater focus on matching the training to the recovery capacity of the athlete, often proves to be a successful maneuver. This becomes one of the best ways to break free from this frustrating stagnation and get back to seeing tangible and consistent progress. So in order to start adjusting and iterating a training program that may be over-intensified, here are a few ideas and reiterations that can be helpful to keep in mind. The first is to grasp that many important adaptations happen independently of intensity. Intensity is just one of many training variables, but one of the most risky to increase. Next, going back to the relative contribution of the energy systems, it's your aerobic fitness, how economical your substrate utilization is, and how well you can limit the fatiguing byproducts associated with glycolysis that are the biggest performance determinants in most cycling disciplines. It's in the aerobic system where there exists the greatest potential for long-term progression. Thirdly, challenging workouts are where the potential for greater fitness is created, and it's in the recovery where this potential is realized. Not considering recovery capacity when your life outside of training is busy and stressful can lead to a lot of work being put in for a comparatively small amount of fitness yield. Training again needs to be paired appropriately to this recovery capacity. So evidently workouts that don't create a great amount of long-lasting fatigue, but still offer excellent endurance benefits, should be a staple part of this kind of program. Fourth, your high-intensity workouts need to be consistently high in quality to have the desired effect. For example, if you were looking to improve the oxygen uptake by stimulating adaptations in the stroke volume of the heart, this requires accruing sustained periods of time in a heart rate range of 90 to 95+% of max. Not an easy task to perform week in, week out, both mentally and physically, if training in a given week or a block of weeks is overly intense. And finally, we feel it's worth pondering the question that if a large proportion of low intensity volume focused on aerobic improvement is so obviously important to the very best athletes with the greatest genetic predispositions for athletic performance, is it not more important for an athlete with less time to focus on this and more than likely less of a genetic gift to fall back on? Now, of course, there are some adjustments that should be made to a program for a time-restricted athlete. Firstly, including a slightly higher proportion of training time focused on muscular endurance, with blocks at a relatively low cadence of between 60 and 70 RPM, and around a sweet spot intensity of 85 to 95% of threshold or functional threshold power. This helps to place an increased load on the muscular system, specifically the slow twitch muscle fibers, to add some fatigue-resistant stress that a long ride would otherwise induce. This addition can be included in around 1 to 2 sessions per week, depending on the athlete's rate of recovery and how restricted their training time actually is. Secondly, utilizing fasted or low glycogen availability workouts, which help to create the metabolic conditions that would usually be experienced towards the end of a long ride, where glycogen stores are depleted and the body is forced to use a higher proportion of fat as the primary substrate, can be very effective at eliciting greater mitochondrial adaptations. We'd include these at most twice a week and ensure that the intensity is kept low throughout. When training is performed first thing in the morning, i.e. before work, and going into the workout without taking on any additional fuel since the night before, this can be a very convenient solution for many. And thirdly, we'd advise including some less structured workouts into a plan to avoid burnout and to preserve the pure enjoyment of just riding a bike. Consistency over the long term is the main thing, and with the rest of a plan typically being very structured and precise, having this little bit of freedom in there can go a long way. Finally then, let's conclude with some planning-based recommendations for building a program that's more focused towards low intensity volume. Firstly, try to find some time for some longer duration workouts somewhere in the week. It's usually easiest to include this type of ride at the weekend if the working week is particularly busy. Longer duration, lower intensity rides really are some of the best workouts that you can use to improve the aerobic capacity, the lactate threshold, and crucially the fraction of the former that the latter occurs at. Next, you'll want to schedule the most intense interval workouts on the working days throughout the rest of the week where time is limited, since duration is far less of a determinant of workout quality with this mode of training. Make sure you're rested before each hard session, where using a alternating hard-easy approach throughout the week can work well, or by using a string of higher intensity days followed by a subsequent period of recovery. Which strategy will work best for you really needs to be determined on an individual basis. Thirdly, using an indoor trainer for some of these sessions can be a good way to cut down the preparation time associated with a ride and also increase the level of control associated with the workout by minimizing interruptions and maximizing time in the intended intensity range for greater workout compliance and intensity discipline. Lastly, make sure you're on top of your all-important recovery by prioritizing the highest impact factors like good sleep and well-composed and timed nutritional practices. This will ensure that between the most challenging workouts, you can adapt as quickly as possible and have the energy to perform the next at the necessary level of quality. As has been pressed throughout this video, recovery is arguably the most important consideration for the time-limited athlete, especially when faced with lots of different stressors in addition to training. Hopefully this video has given you a few tips and suggestions to make your training more efficient and at the same time less driven by this do more and more with less and less idealism that often gets in the way of meaningful long-term improvements in cycling performance. As always, thanks for watching and I'll catch you on another video soon.